As you all probably know as viewers of the channel, I just concluded going through every NBA draft from the last decade and assigning grades to the picks made in the lottery of each one, using the power of hindsight. I may make a few more installments in that series for specific draft classes historically, if that's what you guys want, so comment down below which years you would want to see graded. Obviously, some teams hit big home runs, and others whiffed pretty hard with their picks, which got me thinking about the topic for today's video. Today, we'll once again be going through each draft from this decade, and now we'll be identifying the biggest bust from each year, and discussing why they failed as much as they did. Before we start though, make sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel, as all support is very much appreciated. Now with that being said, let's begin. To start, we'll go back to the way beginning of the decade, and we'll make our way to the present. So starting with the class of 2010, the biggest bust has to be Ekpe Udoh, taken 6th overall by the Golden State Warriors. Udoh was an enticing prospect at the time because of his size and length, possessing a 7-foot 4-inch wingspan and seemingly NBA-ready skills. Obviously though, we now know that those traits didn't exactly translate, and his career was a pretty big flop. In his first 5 years in the league, he played for 3 different teams, and in that time, he only averaged 4 points and 3 rebounds per game, while shooting a pretty poor 43% from the field. He never played a big role on any team he was on, he struggled mightily on the court, and having taken him 6th overall, it was a big whiff of a pick. Some other players from 2010 in contention here were Wesley Johnson and Cole Aldridge, but Johnson was more productive overall and had a much longer career in the league, and then Aldridge was selected 5 picks after Udoh and produced at about the same disappointing level, so ultimately Udoh beat them out. Next up is the class of 2011, and the biggest bust from this draft was Jan Vesely, taken 6th overall by the Washington Wizards. Having drafted John Wall 1 year prior, the Wizards thought they were getting their point guard center combination locked up for at least a decade, hoping that they would develop together into a dominant tandem. While Wall lived up to his end of the bargain, Vesely flamed out in the league rather quickly. He managed to survive only 3 NBA seasons, only averaging about 3 points and 3 rebounds per game in that time, and his development just never came into fruition. He was fairly thin for a big man, and the physicality of the league was something he struggled mightily with. The class of 2011 featured several big-name players that were selected after Vesely, such as Klay Thompson, Kawhi Leonard, and Kemba Walker, so thinking about Vesely taking him over all of them just makes it much worse. Other people in contention for biggest bust of the year were Jimmer Fredette and Derek Williams, but Vesely, in my opinion, just barely edges them out. Next up is the class of 2012, and the biggest bust from this draft is Thomas Robinson, selected 5th overall by the Sacramento Kings. Robinson's absolutely top-tier athleticism and sheer ability to dominate the college game because of it made him an incredibly enticing prospect at the time, but unfortunately, physical attributes and raw athleticism don't always lead to production. He lacked a lot of the basic skills needed to survive in the NBA today as a power forward, and wasn't necessarily good at any individual one thing. With Sacramento, he struggled to score the ball and wasn't playing good defense, and the team clearly saw the writing on the wall early on, so they actually traded him midway through his first season. He would go on to only play 5 seasons in the league and never averaged more than 5 points per game as an end-of-the-bench guy in those years. Other players in contention from this class were Michael Kidd-Gilchrist and Kendall Marshall, but Thomas got the nod in the end. Next up is the class of 2013, and the biggest bust from this draft was, without a doubt, Anthony Bennett, taken 1st overall by the Cleveland Cavaliers. When discussing the biggest busts in NBA history, the conversation cannot be had without bringing up Anthony Bennett's name, because he truly does have a real argument for biggest bust of all time. Even when he was taken 1st overall at the time, people were still scratching their heads because not many analysts or fans thought he would even be in the discussion for the top pick, and when the season began, he didn't exactly do much to quiet those doubts. A good summary of his career can be shown through the fact that he didn't score a single point in his first 4 games, and missed his first 15 shots in the NBA. From there, things didn't exactly get much better, and he was completely out of the league after playing 4 seasons with 4 different teams. Other candidates from this class included Alex Len and Shabazz Muhammad, but neither come close to Bennett in the race. The next class up for discussion is 2014, and the biggest bust from this draft was Nick Stauskas, taken 8th overall by the Sacramento Kings. Stauskas was a fast riser on draft boards after his rapid improvement throughout his time at Michigan, and the one skill scouts assumed would easily translate was his shooting ability. He was a marksman in college and one of the premier perimeter shooters in the country, so at the very least, he would hopefully bring sharpshooting to whoever drafted him, right? Well, that turned out to be wrong, because throughout the majority of his career, that supposed strength of his never was even above league average. And the only year he did shoot above average was in a season where he averaged a mere 4 points per game. Last season was the last season he played in the NBA after bouncing around on 5 teams in a 5-year span. Other candidates from this draft included Dante Exum and Noah Vonleh, and while it was close, Stauskas does take the edge for me for not being on a roster at all this year. Up next is the class of 2015, and the biggest bust from this draft was Mario Hezonja, taken 5th overall by the Orlando Magic. Hezonja is a classic case of a guy whose mixtape caught fire online and the idea of his game greatly outweighed his actual performances. While overseas, he definitely produced a ton of incredible highlight plays that showcased his seemingly elite athleticism and confident shooting ability, making him theoretically someone capable of shining in the NBA. But for a variety of reasons, that just hasn't happened. For one, he's awfully inconsistent, he's prone to make bad decisions, and he struggles on defense. His three-point shooting has always been below league average, his numbers have been empty and were mostly on bad teams, and his impact is minimal. Other players that were considered from this class are Jahlil Okafor and Stanley Johnson, but again, Hezonja just edged them out. Next up is the class of 2016, and the biggest bust from this draft was Dragan Bender, taken 4th overall by the Phoenix Suns. In 2016, there was a lot of hype surrounding Kristaps Porzingis, who was drafted 1 year prior and broke through in a big way after being doubted heavily. Because of this, the hunt for the next unicorn began, and Bender was seemingly that guy. He was tall, mobile, and a good shooter on paper, similar to Kristaps, but yet his time in the NBA has been filled with nothing but struggles and frustration. He puts up a measly 5 points per game, shoots below 40% from the field, which for a big man is awful, and he just hasn't come anywhere close to justifying taking him in the top 5 of a draft. He was sitting at the end of the bench for Milwaukee for almost the entirety of this season until they cut him, and now, heading into free agency, his career is very much up in the air. Other players considered from this draft were Marquise Chriss and Thon Maker, but Bender easily takes the cake. Up next is the class of 2017, and the biggest bust from this draft so far is Josh Jackson, taken 4th overall by the Phoenix Suns. Sound familiar? Unfortunately for Suns fans, they had to watch their team select 4th overall 2 years in a row, and draft complete duds 2 years in a row. Jackson was incredibly highly regarded coming out of Kansas, seen as a potential lockdown defender with solid overall offensive talent. Now, looking at his per-game numbers, you may not think he's been that bad of a player, but I can assure you that there's a lot more than what meets the eye with Jackson. Having been on the Suns for the first 2 seasons, they were always one of the worst teams in the league, and he had a big role right away, so his numbers are already inflated. Plus, if you look at his splits by month, he has typically struggled mightily for the first half of seasons, and then picked things up production-wise after the team is already eliminated from anything important later on in the year, and that's when there's less pressure for him to produce, which is where he thrives. Then you throw in all of his off-the-court issues, the fact that he got traded for very little return, and the fact that he was assigned to the G League for most of last season, and you see a career filled with ups and downs. Other players that were considered from this class were Markelle Fultz and Dennis Smith Jr., but Fultz was mostly hampered with injuries, so picking him didn't seem fair, and Smith Jr. wasn't selected in the top 5. Next up is the class of 2018, and the biggest bust from this draft so far is Kevin Knox, taken 9th overall by the New York Knicks. Now that we're getting closer and closer to the present, picking out players as busts is pretty difficult, but Knox is definitely showing signs of being one early on. Through 2 seasons, he's legitimately been one of the worst players in the entire league, production-wise on both ends of the floor, and from year 1 to year 2, he seemingly got worse. His scoring got cut in half, his shooting efficiency went down in both field goal and three-point percentage, he's still a mess on defense, and in almost every way, he's a negative. He's still super young, and there's obviously still plenty of time for him to figure things out, but so far, he's easily the choice for this list. Others in contention were Mo Bamba and Jerome Robinson, but neither are on Knox's level. And finally, we've now reached the most recent 2019 NBA draft, but unfortunately, I'm going to have to make a cop-out decision and not pick a player for this draft. Having only seen less than a full season from rookies this year, it really doesn't seem fair at all to single one out as the biggest bust candidate because rookies do tend to struggle and then develop over time. Some players that could have been in contention here were Jarrett Culver and Cam Reddish, but both of them also showed a ton of promise at times, and their play on the court did improve as the season went on. Overall, no player from this draft necessarily looks like much of a bust yet, so I just won't pick one. And with that being said, that's all I have for you today. Make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and comment down below who you think are the biggest busts from the last decade. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you all next time.